Hi. Thank you so much, Annie, and thank you to the Tenement Museum for inviting me to do a Tenement talk. I was thinking about it on the way over here. I have always loved the Tenement Museum, and I've been such I think sort of it, in some ways, sort of initiated this interest in objects and stories in some way, so much so that there was a point in time where the Tenement Museum used to have this like vintage shop. I forget, what was it called? It was
an antique shop.
It was or an antique shop, but like something about it was like more magical than like your regular vintage antique shop. And I loved it so much that I tracked down the woman who ran it, and then like I emailed her, and then I like came in and had a conversation with her, and I tried to get a job from her. This was when I was like 23 or something. But I've always loved the sort of intersection between objects and stories that is so evident at the Tenement Museum. And I think that there's just a ton of overlap as well between and why it makes so much sense for Warren Stories to be here, and for me and the contributors to be here tonight. Particularly because there's a lot in Warren Stories and in the Tenement Museum, I think, that's, about, making New York your own, what it's like to become a New Yorker and transforming into being a New Yorker, New York as a character in a story, and I think also just generally, passing things down from generation to generation, immigrant-specific stories. There are quite a few stories, immigrant-specific stories in Warren Stories. And so I just think that there's a lot of overlap in also the sort of mode of storytelling, the kind of experiential way that the stories are told. At least that's what I think. So, and in fact, as I was putting the book together, there were so many New York stories and so many stories that, tied into some aspect of New York that I wound up having to go onto Craigslist and looking for stories elsewhere, and looking for stories in like tiny little towns that I could, add to sort of the mix of stories in the book. So, and just to give you a couple quick examples, I mean, from the book, I mean, there's a story from Ross Intellisano, his Thai, and he tells the story of his Italian immigrant grandmother, who came over, became a seamstress, and was making ties for all the guys in the family, all the men in the family. And when his childhood home was destroyed in Hurricane Sandy, two of the ties were salvaged. And so one of them is what he tells his story about in the book. Or April Bloomfield, the chef, who, the day she got her green card, she was like, what's the most American and New York thing I can possibly do? And she went to David Z on 14th Street and bought a pair of Converse, and has since then just like kept wearing Converse. And then there's also like Nikki Russ Fetterman, of Russ and Daughters, who's in the book, and the story of the white coat that everyone wears when you walk in the door. She's the fourth generation, but for 100 years they've all been wearing this white coat, and so she tells the story of that coat evolving. So I'm just going to jump in, and I'm going to read my story from the book, which is actually a little bit different from the other stories that you'll hear tonight, but just to give you a sense. Oh, yes, could you, yes. Sorry. All right. This is the object, the garment that accompanies the shoes. Like always, I was walking down Rehoboth Avenue with my grandmother. We went past Dolly's Saltwater Taffy, Thrasher's French Fries, Summer Wind's T-shirt shop, and the place where you could dress up in prairie costumes and get your sepia-tone photo taken. Honky-tonk shops that line the main drag and lead to the boardwalk. Stores I'd seen since I was wheeled down the avenue in a stroller. The sun was bright, and I wore conspicuously oversized sunglasses. I could feel the heat on my pink, freckled shoulders as I hobbled along on flip-flops that had just broken. It was my grandmother who insisted we stop into South Moon Under for a new pair. She perused the aisles, her bosom well contained beneath her grandma bathing suit, a netted cover-up. What about these, she asked, gesturing with tan, leathery arms at the pegs full of options, magenta, teal, polka-dotted, striped. Instead, I chose a simple black sturdy pair by Flojo, size 8. My grandmother paid, I slipped on the thongs, as she called them, and we were on our way. As we walked back to my family's red umbrella on the beach, I could hear the Flojos flopping against the wooden boardwalk planks. That was in 1997, but I'm still wearing that pair of Flojos. And since then, flip-flop fashion has become ubiquitous. They've spread beyond summer months, becoming acceptable footwear with suits and cocktail dresses, as well as bathing suits and shorts. Expensive name brands have emerged with bejeweled versions fetching 4 figures. Girls wear gold flip-flop charm necklaces, but for as long as I can remember, I've had exactly 1 pair. Who has flip-flops for 16 years, my sister Lauren asked on a recent family beach vacation. She told me she cycles through a couple pairs every year. They break, they wear out, they get left behind. Mine didn't. And you could chalk that up to a time of a stylistic phase, several years long, during which I only wore boots and hulking multi-inch platform shoes, the footwear component to a nun-like style. I liked being cover-up year-round, even if it meant tights, 20-hole lace-ups, and layers of crinoline under a full skirt in New York City's thickest August humidity. During that stretch, I wouldn't even consider wearing sandals, and my flip-flops emerged from my closet for very occasional pool or beachside use. And yet I kept them, because I hang on to stuff. Like the rest of my belongings, these flip-flops have traveled with me from college to real life, from apartment to apartment, from Wilmington to Providence to New York to Philadelphia, and then back to New York. I've got concert t-shirts from 7th grade, socks from summer camp, long flowing dresses from high school. I guess I find comfort in these things. Through years of inadvertent preservation, these slip-ons have done some globe-trotting. They've been with me in every hotel room where I wanted something between me and the grungy carpet, on every beach from Fire Island to Fenwick Island, from Tulum to Turks and Caicos, in grimy hostel bathrooms on European backpacking trips. It's like I find them waiting for me in my suitcase without realizing I've even packed them. But mostly, these Flojos wind up accompanying me on mundane activities, like sorting delicates at the laundromat, mailing the rent check, or stocking up on apple cider donuts at the farmer's market. That's how, over time, these flip-flops, plain, pulled from a rack without much thought, manufactured to be disposable, but apparently indestructible, have become such a lasting fixture in my life, precisely perhaps because they are so ordinary. You don't even notice them casually accumulating the years, like the shops along Rehoboth Avenue, like grandmothers, like everything. So, thank you. So Annie gave a little bit of an overview of the readers for this evening and the contributors to Worn Stories. And in fact, I mean, I think, and when I've talked about the book, I think, and one of the reasons I wanted to make this book happen is I could give you their bio, but actually hearing their story will tell you so much more about both of them than I could possibly do. So I'll say a couple of quick things, which I think both of the contributors, Debbie Millman and Andrew Kuo, what I really love about both of their stories, and especially in the context of tonight, is that they really paint a picture of a moment in time in New York through a garment. It's, in a way, it's really like a snapshot. And you know, and also, so I think that there's something just very visceral about that. And I also get asked a lot, like, how did these people wind up in the book? And these are two examples of sort of the friend of friend variety, where I came upon, and where, people knew I was working on the book, and they were like, you've got to talk to Debbie, you've got to talk to Andrew. So I will also say that Debbie, if you have not listened to her podcast, Design Matters, you should definitely do that. It's the longest-running podcast about design. And Andrew actually also has a show right now at Marlborough Gallery in Chelsea, the Chelsea location. So you should totally check that out. It's going to be up for another couple of weeks. So with that, I'd like to introduce Andrew and have him read his story.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks for the museum for having us. The Simpsons came out this is kind of about my mom, so it's hard. The Simpsons came out when I was a really young teenager, and Canal Street was a spot where we can find all these new bootleg Bart stuff. My mom would give me $20. I'd eat lunch in Chinatown, and then I'd buy fireworks and a bunch of Bart t-shirts on Canal. Bart Blackman, Bart Marley, Bart as Max Headroom, Buckwheat Bart. Loads of mashups and various degrees of reappropriation. Bart as Max Headroom saying, "Cowabunga, dude," like the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. I think that was the golden age of mashups, when people would pirate Photoshop or Illustrator and make their own t-shirts, flyers, or logos. You didn't know what was real and what wasn't, and it didn't really matter. I loved basketball, so I was really into the Air Bartman shirts with the Jumpman logo. I've since lost all of them, or my mom had gotten rid of them, except for one Air Bartman shirt. I'm a lifelong Knicks fan, unfortunately, and when Linsanity happened in 2012, it was a really emotional thing for me. Not only was it a rags to riches, David and Goliath kind of story, but it was also an Asian dude doing it. He wasn't especially tall or fast, but he took the city, my favorite city, by storm. It was spring and getting warmer, and I'd walk down the street. And people would be like, "Jeremy Lin, is he playing tonight? Construction workers?" People behind the counter at bodegas, everyone was like, "Jeremy Lin, Jeremy Lin." Growing up in New York, I saw divisive moments, but Linsanity brought the city together. At the same time, an undercurrent of weirdness got tapped into with Linsanity. You'd see references to chopsticks, slanted eyes, and while it wasn't really racist, I didn't appreciate the sentiment. I wanted to make something about the moment in time, and I recall those black Bartman shirts from the 80s that had sparked a controversy when they first came out. Using the Air Bartman shirt I'd held onto as a model, I made this Jeremy Lin shirt. In fact, I printed quite a few of them myself and gave them away to anyone who wanted one, which is what I do with all the t-shirts I make. I thought it was perfect, a yellow character that was not racist and a version of the moment that also tapped into my childhood, to a character that previously had used to talk about racial sensitivity issues. Linsanity uncovered prejudices I encountered growing up Asian. Jeremy headlines like, "Who said Asians can't drive?" and "Chink in the armor" reinforce how the public thinks about Asian people, sometimes true, sometimes not. I don't know if the craziness around Linsanity would have happened if he was white. It only lasted a few weeks. They worked him too hard, and he hurt his knee. He got traded to Houston, and the madness was over. It was heartbreaking, and I made another t-shirt about that moment so I could relax myself. Bart Simpson drinking a purple drink saying, "Don't have a cow, man."
Debbie, would you like to come up?
Thank you, Emily, for giving me the honor of being part of this really wonderful, poignant book. And thank you, Andrew. It's an honor to be beside you. I want to set the stage for this story. I'm a native New Yorker. I was born in Brooklyn and then moved when I was about 2 years old to Howard Beach, Queens. And then in the middle of the 3rd grade, I moved to Staten Island and lived there for several years before my parents got divorced. My dad hightailed it to Manhattan, and my mom took my brother and I, and we moved to Long Island. So when I graduated college in 1983, I went to SUNY Albany, all New York, all the time. And I moved to Manhattan and only lived for the first about 10 years or so in tenements. That's all I could afford. My first apartment was a fourth floor tenement walk-up. I had to walk through my roommate's bedroom to get to mine. It was a classic railroad flat, which made for difficulties because my roommates were a couple. You can only imagine the times I was stuck one side or the other. In any case, I really watched my nickels and dimes so I could pay my rent. And this story happens right in the middle of that experience. So it's the late 80s, very early 90s, New York City. I don't remember her name. I remember how she smelled. It was a heady mix of baby powder, and wildflowers with a sliver of orange. I'd never experienced anything like it before. It was 25 years ago, and I just met her. She was the prospective client in a pitch for a graphic design project. She was slender and elegant, with thin arms and a long neck. As an awkward, chubby, 20-something New Yorker, I nearly always felt ashamed in the presence of women who projected her kind of confidence, but it didn't stop me from trying to emulate them. When I commented on her perfume and asked what it was, she said something that sounded like Fabergé, but I knew it wasn't Fabergé. I was familiar with what Fabergé smelled like. All the girls wore it in high school. This was not that fragrance, not by a long shot. We didn't win the project, but I couldn't stop thinking about that perfume. I went searching at Macy's and tried Bloomingdale's and Loehmann's, but no avail. I made my way over to Saks Fifth Avenue, but felt shabby and intimidated by the sophisticated sales ladies and was afraid to ask for help. I poked around the cosmetics counters, and when one of the makeup artists asked if I wanted a makeover, I shook my head no. When she asked if she could help me with anything, I cleared my throat and asked if she'd ever heard of a citrusy-smelling fragrance with a name like Fabergé. She thought for a minute, and then her face lit up. She thought I might be talking about Faubourg, a new fragrance by Hermès. I asked her which counter might have it. She frowned and indicated that they didn't sell the fragrance at Saks, but I could get it at the Hermès boutique on Madison Avenue, just a few blocks away. I nearly ran to the store. When I got there, a man in uniform opened the door for me, and I entered the most elegantly expensive environment I had ever been in. $200 scarves and $10,000 bags were neatly arranged on glass counters, shiny leather saddles hung on the walls, and everyone browsing looked very, very rich, except for me. I found Faubourg and gulped when the sales lady stated the price. I wondered whether a bottle of perfume could be worth so much and meekly asked if I could try it. I swooned as soon as the spray hit my skin and handed over my credit card. Every couple of months, I took the E-train and walked to Hermès for a refill, but I couldn't afford to buy anything else. That changed when I visited the store in July 1990. A sales lady beckoned me closer and whispered, "We're having a sale on select items upstairs." Even with the markdowns, I couldn't afford anything. And then I saw the most beautiful coat. It was the softest, most luxurious, ultra-bright, lemony yellow cashmere coat ever made. It had big, floppy lapels and a belt that cinched at the waist. I was certain it would cost thousands of dollars. And it did. $2,000. This was crossed out. It was now $400. I calculated what the expense would mean to my budget and my rent. Undeterred, I tried the coat on. It was at least one size too big. None of this mattered to me. I felt glamorous and beautiful. As the clerk wrapped up the coat in the biggest orange box I had ever seen, I knew this wasn't a mistake. I would wear this coat forever. And wear it I did. I wore it every day from September until March. I wore it to work. I wore it every weekend. I wore it on vacation in Vermont. I wore it traveling to the West Coast. The only time I wished for a warmer coat was en route to a client's office on Fifth Avenue one blustery sub-zero February afternoon. I was chewing a large piece of purple bubble gum and realized I'd have to get rid of it before my meeting. It was so cold, I didn't want to take my glove off to take the gum out of my mouth. Perhaps the temperature affected my judgment, or perhaps I was lazy, but suddenly I did something that I had never, ever done before. I raised my chin, puckered up my lips, and let my gum fly. As it descended onto the sidewalk, I saw that a man walking toward me was about to collide with the arc of its fall. I made eye contact with him as the sticky mass fell at his feet. Horrified, I instantly realized I was face to face with Woody Allen. Mercifully, he sidestepped the gum, but his outrage was palpable. He shook his head in disgust and passed me by. I was too embarrassed and frightened to even say, "I'm sorry." 2 days later, I went out with my friend Ellen. She had snagged a reservation at the newly reopened Le Cirque, and we got all dolled up for the occasion. I, of course, wore my yellow coat. We were seated between the coat check and the front door, and since New York City was still in a deep freeze, I decided to keep my coat wrapped around me. Then I saw him. He was approaching the coat check with his wife, fumbling for his ticket. Wildly, I looked around for a place to hide. Ellen asked me if I was okay, and I hissed no. I motioned with my eyes. Ellen squealed in delight, and he looked over at us. Once again, in the span of 48 hours, face with Woody Allen. Our eyes locked, and I saw him recognize my unmistakable, ultra-bright yellow coat and the same frightened face. He grimaced. "You!" he said as his wife pulled on his arm. I felt myself turn white and then red as everyone turned to stare. 2.5 decades later, I still have my beloved coat. It's lost its belt and much of its lemony sheen, but it hasn't left its special place in my closet in a long time. Maybe I'll wear it again one day. As Woody Allen famously said, "Eternal nothingness is fine if you happen to be dressed for it." I'll remind him of that if I ever bump into him again. Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie and Andrew. It was so great. Plus the surprise coat.
Thank you guys for the amazing readings. And thank you, Emily, for this beautiful, beautiful book. I want to start by reading the Louise Bourgeois quote with which it opens. It gives me a great pleasure to keep my clothes, my dresses, my stockings. I have never thrown away a pair of shoes of mine in 20 years. I cannot separate myself from my clothes nor a lens. The pretext is that they are still good. It is my past, and as rotten as it was, I would like to take it and hold it tight in my arms. Now, in the introduction, you mention going to the Salvation Army and seeing what happens to the secondhand clothes.
A nameless
national thrift store chain. This book not brought to you by the Salvation Army. And the clothes end up, the ones that are discarded, that are not deemed worth for selling, end up in this thing called the hole, which is this chute, and they get packed up into these gigantic, colorful mounds, 2,000-pound cubes. I remember you telling me about this after you had gone to the factory and being so shaken by it. And it wasn't until I read about it again in the introduction that I remembered something, which is that, so these packs go into third world countries where they're sold and shredded. I grew up in one of those third world countries at the time, Bulgaria, and in the early 90s, all these secondhand thrift shops started cropping up. And my mother became obsessed with them. And she started shopping at them all the time, bringing home these clothes that came probably from the chute, from the hole. And I used to loathe them, not only because it reminded me of the fact that we couldn't afford first-hand clothes, but because they felt like these disembodied objects. They all smelled the same, of this sort of chemical, these dry cleaning, disinfectant, and they were literally sterilized of the lives that were in them once, and it wasn't until I read this that I realized what feels so murderous about them, that they are disembodied stories. You don't know what deaths and divorces and things led people to dispose of them. And what you do so beautifully with the book is that you tease out those very personal stories that we shield within the clothes that we wear as protection, as projection. So I'm wondering how your feelings about the chute and these clothes have evolved as you've been gathering the stories. And by the time you went, you had most of the stories, right? Sort of.
Probably half at that point.
How does it all fit with this sort of strange compression of lives?
I mean, I think it only makes me want to have less stuff in general, to be more thoughtful about what I bring into my apartment, specifically around clothing. I used to also just I feel like, I always was getting a lot of stuff from thrift stores, being sort of cutting it down. And my hope is that in some ways this book will, at least shift people's thinking a little bit in terms of their habits around consumption, and that perhaps when they open up their closet and they're like, I wish I had the newest blah, 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 rather they'll actually see, the shirt that was handed down from someone or given to them by a friend, or that they wore to some specific experience, and that will actually carry more weight than, the newest, latest, hippest thing, or the designer something or other. I think it's just kind of, as I've worked on this project, it's kind of reinforced that more, and also just made me want less stuff.
And how did this sort of evolve from your earlier project, Sentimental Valley, where you culled these crazy, amazing stories from eBay and people's sort of clothing stores, which was really kind of about the allure of the little clues left behind by the second lives of clothes?
Well, I think that I was finding, so Sentimental Value is, it's a collection of stories that I have found on eBay where people share what they did while they were wearing the clothes and why they're getting rid of them.
They're absolutely amazing, by the way. Look up Emily's site. It's mind-blowing.
And so, thank you. So I've collected like 600 of them and started the project in like 2007. And I think that actually got me started just thinking about, well, if this is like, eBay is not a platform that's meant for any kind of storytelling. I mean, it's really about, making a financial transaction, buying and selling. And if, seeping through the cracks, even people felt compelled to share something about what they were getting rid of. And that was like when I was digging and just finding these things and kind of, collecting them, then what would happen if I just actually began asking people? If it was a little bit more direct. And so, and the stories that are on sentimental value there's something like, found stories from the internet, the language of the internet. It's very kind of informal mode of storytelling. But the focus with Worn Stories was being a little bit more deliberate about who I asked to contribute a story, and also really focusing on the story itself, the way that the story was told.
So the sort of the flip side of these sold clothes that sort of that are disposed of from the human lifetime before it's over is the opposite, which is where clothes outlive their owners. Let's talk about David Carr. When he died suddenly and unexpectedly last month, a lot of people were devastated, and not just those of us who were his friends, but the many, many people who found him to be a New York voice and a person who told stories that mattered. For those of you on the off chance there's somebody who didn't know David Carr, he was a journalist for the New York Times, and he died last month, very suddenly. And so the morning after he died, I reread his memoir, and one line in it stopped my breath. He wrote, "We all walk this earth feeling we are frauds. The trick is to be grateful and hope the caper doesn't end anytime soon." Now, I immediately thought of the sort of grim symbolism of the story that he did for you, this shirt that he found in a generic tourist souvenir shop. There was a defective shirt with the words New York printed upside down, and sort of how it spoke to what happened when he died, how many New Yorkers felt their worlds turned upside down, but also this really beautiful and bittersweet way in which you can kind of picture him walking down a Manhattan sidewalk with this literally fraudulent shirt, this is a scam shirt, and walking anyway. And I thought that's what that line in his memoir was about. That was his life was about. And so how did this story come about, and how have your feelings about it changed between the time he wrote it, when it was kind of just funny and irreverent, and now when it's so poignant in hindsight?
Mm-hmm. Well, in fact, David was, and I actually also, I felt compelled to sort of share it. I haven't shared a lot of the stories that are in the book on the Worn Stories website, but after he died suddenly, I just felt, I remember, I have such specific memories, not only of obviously all the stories, but how I got each story and the experience of sitting down or talking to someone, I remember like having mint lemonade iced tea at the Smile, and like sitting across from you as you were sharing your story. Like I remember all these very vivid details. And with David, he was open to sharing his story with me before I even had a book deal. He saw, and not only did he want to share his story, but then he also wanted to put me in touch with like 5 other people that he thought would have good stories, or would, who he could see this project meshing with in some way. He was just so open and so generous. And he just, he had a sense of humor, but there's something really about, and now it is kind of incredible that the story was amusing, funny. You could sort of hear his voice in it very clearly, but it ends with this sort of on a melancholy note that talks about, when the shirt will disappear from it, when his wife will sort of take the shirt and it'll be so stained and falling apart that she'll just get rid of it, and he'll miss it. And it just is this, moment where suddenly, the shirt and he kind of cohere in this.
And especially thinking about the fact that his wife probably still has the shirt.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you want to read that story?
I can read that story.
I
Yeah.
think we should
Yeah.
hear it. Yeah.
Do you have it?
Yeah. I have it in one of my Japanese sticky notes.
Oh, we actually have. Yeah. So he says, I live in the New Jersey suburbs where the morning weather often bears little or no relation to what the weather might be like in the afternoon in New York, where I work. Many days, I have miscalculated my clothing needs for the day, in part because I work in Midtown in a forest of tall buildings, and if there is a chill in the air, it is multiplied by the wind that becomes amplified and focused in the canyons of structures around me. I generally deal with the dissonance by refusing to go outside or by grabbing a fake cashmere scarf for $5 off the street vendor tables in Times Square. The other thing I think, just I'm interrupting myself, is like this story, I think the other reason that Maria had probably, what we were talking about, is it's so also specific to coming to New York and becoming a New Yorker. And so there's, yeah, not beyond the sort of.
And it sort of ties in all these elements of time, place, and person, which are so central to the
Right,
book.
right,
All the
exactly,
stories in the book.
exactly. So there are a variety of reasons. He says, I generally deal with the dissonance by refusing to go outside or grabbing a cashmere scarf for $5. I think there is a direct relationship between what you pay for an item and how long you hang on to it. So those scarves tend to come and go. Though I do have a watch I bought on Canal Street almost a decade ago for $5, and it is still with me. I wear it every day and replace the battery every few years for more than the cost of the watch, but that's a different story. Even if they last, I'm a spiller, so they become a sort of napkin after a while, and my wife quietly retires them without telling me. On a very hot day last summer, I had the opposite problem. I left for work, dressed for a rare television shoot, which means that I put on a sport coat and dress shirt with a tie on top and wore the usual black jeans and sneakers on bottom. After work, I was meeting a pal at the Frying Pan, which is a bar on a no longer seaworthy boat off the pier in Chelsea. The bar is aptly named. On a sunny day, the light and heat reflecting off the water mean that the people on the boat are slowly sautéed. Yes, a sunset on the Hudson is an amazing thing, so spectacular that even my home state of New Jersey looks majestic. But it can get very hot out there. It's also worth mentioning that Manhattan itself throws off a fair amount of heat because of this so-called heat island effect. And he actually, when he sent me this story, he sent me a diagram of the heat island effect, too. It was still very hot when I left my office at the end of the day, and even though I left behind my sport coat, the sun immediately absorbed the dark dress shirt I was wearing. So I walked down the street to the tourist shops of Times Square for an old T-shirt that I could wear. Even at $6 a pop, they were all hideous. All of them swaddled in the announcement that the wearer was, in fact, or had once been, on a particular island off the coast of America called New York. I was just about to give up. My fading hipster cred, already suffering many hellacious blows because of advancing age, would not allow me to wear a shirt suggesting that I heart New York. You can't wear a shirt like that, ironically, unless, say, you hate New York, which I do not. I still have an immigrant's ardor for the place, having come here a decade ago for a job. Before my family joined me, I lived in Tribeca for a few months. My second day in New York, I rode my bike into a fence at Broadway and Canal because I was looking up at a pair of tall buildings downtown. Those buildings are now gone, but the wonder, the sense of awe at traveling through one of humankind's greatest creations remains. And then I saw one, extra large, thank God, in which the classic New York script had been misprinted upside down. I knew what to do. I turned to the guy running the shop and said, "This one is a misprint. I'll give you $3." He said nothing but nodded. I paid in 2 crumpled bills and quarters, ducked behind a rack, and put it on. As soon as I stepped out onto the street, people stared. I got on the C at 23rd Street, and a kid next to me stared at the logo over my burgeoning middle-aged midsection and said, "I like your shirt." "Thanks, man. $3." Whenever I wear this shirt in New York, waitresses, bartenders, cab drivers, they all say nice things about this shirt and ignore the fact that the rack it's hanging on could use some work. When I travel, which is fairly often, and wear the shirt, which is less often, nobody ever says anything. I like that about my shirt. It's intuitively understood in the city, as we insufferable locals call it, and is baffling to others, akin to many other aspects of living or working in New York. I daydreamed for a while about getting some pals of my wife in the clothing business to crank out a few hundred. I even had a slogan for the back, quote, turning New York upside down, one shirt at a time. But then someone in the business explained to me that you couldn't trademark the idea of turning letters someone else created upside down. So I just wear mine instead. It won't last. It's white for one thing, and a series of small food and beverage disasters have already begun to dapple its surface. One day it will accumulate enough stains and history so that it will mysteriously disappear from my drawer. I will miss it.
So the flip side of this rather sad story is this notion of survivorship and clothes and people. And one of the most remarkable stories in the book is by a woman named Dorothy Finger, who is literally a survivor of the Holocaust. Tell us a little bit about that story and how it's very long. We're not going to read it, but you should, because it's absolutely remarkable, and how it came about and sort of how it becomes sort of a meta-narrative for all the stories in a way.
Sure. Dorothy Finger is this vivacious 80-something-year-old woman who lives in Wilmington, Delaware, which is my hometown. And I was giving a talk for one reason or another in Wilmington about my work, and she came up to me afterwards. This was before the book, obviously. I think it was just in the beginning stages, and she's like, well, I have a story. And I was like, all right, okay, like keeping, always, because everyone always sort of has a story. So, and I love hearing them, but then she starts telling me her story, and it kind of knocked my socks off. And her story, which is a very lengthy story, is just about basically surviving the Holocaust. And her parents owned a department store, and she wound up surviving by living in a forest for a year in Russia. And when she was able to leave the forest, she went back to her hometown and went to her parents' friend's house. And her family had given the friends a bolt of fabric from her parents' department store. And so she got that fabric.
And they were all dead, by the way, all of her family.
Yes,
all she had was the fabric.
So, and the fabric was the only thing that her mother had ever touched. And for one thing led to another. She wound up in Wilmington, Delaware, of all places, because of some family connections. And enrolled in high school, graduated pretty quickly, and as a graduation gift, her uncle gave her $25, and this was, in the mid-40s, enough to get a suit made out of the fabric, and so she did. And, she ends the story by just saying, that she actually never really liked how the suit looked on her, so she didn't wear it that much, but, and she also said she was planning to be buried in it, but that if she can, telling the story, she decided that was actually not what she wanted to do, because if the garment can, be out in the world and the story can continue to be told through the garment, then that she was much more satisfied with that.
And what's interesting about her story is that here's a piece of clothing that, unlike the other garments in the book, felt like a poor fit, literally and figuratively, for her, but had all her history in it. And on the other hand, so many of the stories are about how they're part of our personal myth-making, that we seek out these garments or we hold on to them because they tell the story who we are so well. And actually, the other day, I was reading the diaries of the poet Elizabeth Bishop, and I came across this passage that I'm going to read you just a couple sentences that made me think of this project. She is writing to a friend and asking her friend to go to a department store for her. And she says, "I feel I simply cannot live much longer unless I have a wool jacket in black watch plaid. There was one at Abercrombie's I almost bought, then thought I was being extravagant, and I also didn't think the plaid was authentic. But they're all over the place now, and since one of the first things I remember about you is that little book bound in plaid that you carry on the cape, I feel you're the natural victim for this commission. Will you? I want just a regular sack coat, I guess you call it, or blazer, like a boy's, or a boy's would do if they aren't any girls right. I like dark buttons better than brass, but it doesn't matter. I can change them." And what I liked about it is that she clearly had written a story of herself and her life as a person in a plaid coat. And she must have it in order to live as that person. And so many of the stories in the book have that element that either predates the garment or is created together simultaneously as the garment story unfolds. How did you sort of navigate that maze of identity and garment to sort of, I guess, cull the best stories that best align these threads of personal development?
Well, I think, for the most part, I think that we buy things or, we have clothing, and then our experiences get mapped onto them. I think that, clothing is very porous. It takes on smells and disintegrates and, it rips, and you can tell that it's been worn. And I think that for the most part, we don't know what's going to happen when we buy something. It's a sort of second skin to us as we walk through the world. And I love the sort of the surprise of what is going to happen, not knowing what's going to happen. So I think most of the people who I spoke to, there was that element of surprise. I mean, there were layers of surprise because I would have no idea what kind of story they were going to share with me when I got on the phone with them or asked them to contribute. And then there was the element of surprise for them, not that they had no idea that something was going to happen to them while they were wearing that piece of clothing. Even the stories, there's a story, Kenneth Goldsmith has a story in the book, and it's it's a Tom Brown suit that he wore to read poetry to Obama at the White House. So he was obviously, and it's this like crazy, it's a white suit, with this huge paisley pattern all over print. He was very, very, very deliberate about wearing it and choosing it to wear to basically, his poetry is like traffic reports. So he was reading traffic reports to Obama at the White House, wearing this paisley suit that, later Jon Stewart teased him on The Daily Show, was like, oh, did this guy just realize he was, speaking at the White House and he, pulled some wallpaper down. But the thing is, and put it on. But the thing is that, okay, so he was very deliberate about that, but he actually didn't know what interaction he was going to have with Obama, who he had, a pretty comical exchange with him, and what would happen during that day. So I think even when there's this desire to kind of like buy something to fit into a specific mold or into a specific, personality. You just really, with with most of these stories, somehow it goes awry, or there's an unexpected nature that you just can't really plan for.
And I think actually the exchange that he had with the president was very poignant in terms of what these stories are about, because Obama looks up at him and says, "Nice suit. My staff would never let me wear that." And this notion of clothing as what we give ourselves permission to be or to not be, the sort of permeable membrane between private person and public persona, that we use the clothing to sort of mediate these two things. And on that note, I think we should ask people for.
I can wear whatever I want.
Yeah.
Questions? Comments? Stories?
Stories.
Hi, I don't really have a story. I just wanted to say thank you, and I wanted to maybe ask, in all these stories and all these different people, do you find, what kind of thread do you see about humanity? I mean, you're basically telling us anyway, but I just wanted to ask that in this direct question, and I can't wait to read it. Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. That's kind of a big question. I mean, I think that what I have come away with is everyone has a story. Everyone has a story, and I think that maybe I've also working on the book has made me a little bit neurotic because it has made me feel like I want to collect all those stories before they disappear, before they kind of go down the chute. Like I saw in the Salvation Army, where they no longer had their stories attached to it. They no longer had, the things that happened while the person was wearing them. So, and I think also there's just, there's something about this project where, I've learned that even if, people say like, I don't care about fashion, I don't care, like that, but this is that it's just almost everyone still has something, some little something or other that they hold on to. It could be clothing, it could be an object, but that they hold on to because it has some kind of story or memory attached to it. So just I think I don't think I quite realized like how universal the project could be or would be, and the types of story. There's a section on the Warren Stories website where people can submit their own stories. And just like I get stories from all over the place, and there's no specific set demographic, or there's no, it's all kinds of people who are submitting.
I can add, as somebody who has read the book many times over and loves it, I think one of the sort of human threads that comes out most, perhaps the biggest one, is that we share this longing to belong to our own lives, and we try to imbue this little blink of existence we've been given with as much of ourselves as we're able, and clothing is part of that.
Thank you. As a fashion designer and someone who has a very complicated relationship with the material world, I'd like to ask you, I'm very inspired and enchanted by the work of Louise Bourgeois, and I'd like to ask you how you felt when you first saw one of her cloth works. How did you react to it?
Especially because of the hyphen on how she spells cloth.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Well, I mean, I think that there was something that was. It's weird. The first, comforting. I felt like comforted. I don't know. Maybe that's a strange way to respond, but I felt like I have been. I also have a very conflicted relationship to clothing and to fashion and to the things that we wear and why we wear them. And I think I felt like I found a person who I wish I'd been able to talk to her about it. There was that sort of feeling of like, she got it, she gets it, she got it way before me, and like, man, I would have loved to have like sat down and had tea with her.
This is so lovely. Thank you. I actually ran into your book at another place last week, and I was fascinated. So I had to buy it already. So I am also an immigrant, also from Bulgaria, also Maria, and moving from place to place, which we do in New York and all over the country. There's just so many. When you have to move your clothes from place to place all the time, you always go through and you select what to take along. And so I'm kind of doing this already, which is to take a picture of these beloved clothes that I know I just can't wear anymore, like the paisley. And so this is super inspiring because to write up a story for each, because right now my clothing archive is just pictures of the clothes, but I'm actually going to go home and write stories about those. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
This is super inspiring.
I'm glad. And
it's not a question, but just thank you.
No, and you should, and please, please, it would be great if you would
maybe I'll
submit
send you
them.
the paisley.
I also didn't realize that was another sort of thing that has come out of this project, which I didn't quite realize, because a lot of the people are writing about things that they have and they'll hold on to for a while. But I did this workshop in Portland, and a woman brought a fur coat with her. That had been her mother's, and then she brought like a Xerox copy of the shop where it had come from, and she's like, "Look, this fur coat meant the world to my mother. This was a huge, huge purchase. Like my father bought it for her, had her initials embroidered in it. She's like, but I'm never gonna wear this thing, and I don't know what to do." And I was like, "Okay, well, let's write the story. Let's document it. Let's take let's sort of gather all the information." And then see how you feel about it. And I wound up hearing from her, and she was like, great. I feel, it's been documented. The story has been told. I don't need to have this fur thing hanging in my closet anymore, and she was able to get rid of it. So I think that I didn't quite realize that would also be a bit of a byproduct, this way of holding on to memories and holding on to stories, but maybe not having the weight of the object, especially in New York and with our small apartments.
Exactly. Spot on. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay, I have two. First, I'm Scott, and I've been to Bulgaria. I have never lived there.
Okay, are there any more Bulgarians in the room, really?
I almost died in Bulgaria, but that's a car story. So I got to go to my clothes story. I lived in Africa for a year, and the bulk clothes, the Salvation Army bundles, well, they go to Africa, right? So it was not uncommon to see men wearing women's clothes, right? Because they didn't know that they're women's clothes. They just they were colorful, they looked cool. So in our neighborhood, there was a dude who had on these turquoise capri pants. And so my wife and I would always, are you talking about Capri Man? Because he became known as the Capri Man. But another clothes story is I taught in Romania. And so one of the students that we got really close to, she had a very nice, professionally made portrait, the kind like you go to the studio and get. And so obviously she was very proud of the T-shirt that she had. And, over in abroad, they tend to like, English word T-shirts. And she could speak English, but the T-shirt that she had for her formal portrait said, "Last Chance Saloon." Liquor in the front and poker in the back. And so that was her portrait photo.
Thanks.
Hi. So in reading a lot of these stories, I actually wanted to think about mass production and what makes something have a story or feel special enough to choose it. And it seemed like many of them were thrift store finds, like the David Carr misprint, or homemade by the mom in the case of the tie. And I think of all the things that I have, and the ones that are most special are either gifts or something that feels one of a kind. So I guess just thinking that we have fast fashion and so much that's like mass-made, disposable, does that in any way affect in what you've, trends or patterns in what can make a piece of clothing meaningful to somebody?
I would think that it would, and I feel like the answer I'd love to give you is yes, except that I also think that, if you flip through the book, there are some of those, and then there are just like, the T-shirt that is sort of
The
like
flip-flops.
Flip-flops, like nondescript, things that just have these stories and experiences that wind up getting mapped onto them. I think, you're starting at a sort of richer place innately if it's been given to you or if it's a vintage piece, like you already are kind of, you're starting like a few steps ahead of the game maybe. But then also, I think that when I was selecting stories for the book, I wanted a real cross section. Like I didn't want everything to feel like really precious. Because that's just not sort of how I think it works. And we're not walking around just like, sort of like with, dripping sentimentality and preciousness. Like we're kind of walking around with like, like T-shirts and jeans and stuff, but then crazy shit happens while we're wearing it. And so I wanted to have a cross section.
I guess I was thinking like the ones that were normal that became special had something crazy, like he got stabbed. And he has a hole in his shirt now, and he looks at the hole and he thinks of getting stabbed. Whereas, like,
It's true, it's in the book.
other ones that, other ones where it's about this made me feel like who I am, or it fit me in a way that I don't usually feel, or it was about identity or bringing something out of them, rather as like having a stain or mark of a crazy experience.
I think the difference and the similarity is that the ones you're describing are the types of garments that come with a story baked in already, either from the person that gave it or from the making or the legacy or whatever it is. And on the one hand, that does put you further ahead in that there's already a story. But on the other hand, the mass-produced are almost like a John Locke of clothing. It's a blank slate, and then you get to fill it with more experience. I know, that was a bit of... But in any case, I think that's sort of the flip sides.
Yeah, I think that yes, and I'm also like as you were talking and as you I'm thinking about a little bit more like the sort of coming into yourself and the identity and finding comfort in a garment or something. And I think you're right. I mean, definitely that's something I think that has come out through the stories that are like the passed down, handed down, vintage kind of pieces. That sort of feeling like I've come into myself.
I'll do the last question. We have a program here where we work with school children, and we don't focus simply on clothing, but we basically have the school children go back and bring an object that tells their family's immigration story. And we get amazing stories from this process, from a Ecuadorian sheep whistle that was brought over to, recipes, total range. And what the kids have to say is really amazing. And when you put it all together, you really get a sense of all the amazing stories that exist in the city. And no matter where people come from or when they arrive, there's some kind of universality to that. And I was wondering if you've ever thought of if you have worked with kids on this project or would ever do that, and how you might imagine the types of stories would change, or what would kids maybe bring to this that adults haven't.
I haven't worked with kids on this, but I would be open to it. I think that would actually be really fun. And I think not having kids and not knowing, just that my sense is that they'd be a little bit less encumbered by some of the sort of cultural norms and the way that things are supposed to be, and rather kind of just, more open and more receptive and perhaps, creative in a different way.
I mean, the other thing I was thinking too about kids, right? And as a mother, constantly having to refill my daughter's closet as she grows out of things. They grow out of things. So we can hold on to things for a long time and wear them and keep them, but kids, their memories are going to keep shifting and they don't always get to keep things. Anyways, I want to thank our wonderful participants. I also want to very much heed Emily's warning, right? Emily told us, only bring things into our home that have meaning. Don't just add that don't. But one thing that really does have meaning, not just one meaning, but multiple meanings, and will give you hours of pleasure, is her book, Worn Stories, which you can buy tonight and have her sign it. We offer I have to put my peddler's cap on now, but we offer a 15% discount if you purchase the book tonight at the store. And now this also will not add to your home, so you can keep your home free, but it will enrich your soul and your stomach. Russ and Daughters Cafe, which is just across the street, we have a wonderful partnership with them, and they want you to continue the conversation at Russ and Daughters, and to that effect will give you a 10% discount on your drinks and food if you also show proof of purchase of a book. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's really, really wonderful, and it helps support institutions. One of the threads tonight, too, was the way in which in our building we are able to tell these stories and collect these stories, and we would love to invite you to come on a tour. One way that makes it really easy to come on tours, and not just go on one tour, but multiple tours, is becoming a member of the museum, which you can do that tonight. And it also isn't something that you need to bring home and fill up your house. So you can get membership and come back to the museum and kind of keep learning more about the stories that I think make us New York and make us interesting. So I want to thank all of our contributors tonight, Debbie, Andrew, Maria, and Emily. And I want to thank all of you for coming and being such a wonderful group here at the Tenement Museum. Thank you.